Welcome to day 2 of learning philosophy through Sophie's world. We are now going to go into the chapters, in-depth look into the chapters of the garden, the top hat, and the myths. At least the material that's in there. We're not necessarily going to tackle them in that order. But let's take a look at this thing called mythology. Now, mythology is a really difficult concept in one sense. I want to show you what I mean exactly, because sometimes people think of mythology in one of two ways. We'll often, in an informal, colloquial, we can say, context, just everyday business between people, we'll often think of mythology as either a sort of version of history, or we'll think of mythology or just myths in general as just something that's false. And neither of these actually capture what mythology is. We're using both of those versions. We're using, on the first hand, we're using history in a very colloquial way, a non-rigorous way, and I'm going to use this unrigorous term a lot. Rigorous, we're not fully defining or assessing what we mean by such and such. So we're either looking at history in a non-rigorous way, or we're looking at myth itself in a non-rigorous way. Let's take a look at myth the way that a modern-day historian would look at myth. Not everybody, of course. I can't claim all historians look at it this way. But this is certainly the way that I would propose, not propose, but agree with, that I know a number do. So on the one hand, we have mythology. Now, historically speaking, mythology is not really history as such. What I mean by that is, if we think of history in a more rigorous way, in a specific way, and excuse me for the light that bounces all over the place here, but in a specific way, history would be the way that you and I typically think about it, an account of something where somebody went about trying to ascertain, figure out an exact date, what persons were involved in an event. So when did the event take place? Who was in the event? Why did that event come about? Why did that phenomenon come about? Why did so-and-so do this or that at that time? This more specific, rigorous version of history, and it's not, we're just, touching the tip of the iceberg, really. But this is a recent modern development, at least in the context of, potentially, 10,000 plus years. Now, there's somewhere in between here, and we'll get to that in a second. But let's talk about then what we should maybe frame mythology as then, because myth is, again, not a simple term either. So if history more rigorously defined doesn't quite cover mythology in the same sense. Why? Because mythology is not as simple as an account of this person did this at this time. We have the question of whether or not the people were involved were real beings in the way that you and I sitting here are real beings. We need to call into question if the time of the event named really took place at 8,000 years back, or 12,000 years back, or 5 years ago, or only a few hundred years ago. We need to question that, as a historian would. And we would question as well if the motivations involved are not of said person, this person who we're still trying to deem is or doesn't exist in the way that is proposed in the myth. We have to question whether or not the motives for what that person did, whether that god, one of these gods featured here in this famous painting by Giordano or someone else, or any other number of gods or other mythological beings, whether or not those intentions and motivations are not actually our intentions or motivations as the writers of that mythology. That is, the account holder. See, people throughout history have not the same way. I've not always thought of history the same way in the loose way I'm using history. They've not always thought of events happening in the world the way that we think of them now. Modern history really is a modern occurrence, trying to capture things this way, the way that a scientist might try and actually make observations and capture measurements and data of things happening in the world. So we shouldn't expect mythology to run in its accounts for the world and so forth to work the same way or give the same account of what's true or what's not true based on actual events. And yet, this is commonly what people will defend tooth and nail over, their religion and so forth over. Quick note on that, by the way, the word religion I just used. When does religion actually occur? Mythology, I would argue, does not have to do directly with religion. That is what I should say is it has a direct connection to religion, but you could have mythology without necessarily religion, in my view. But you couldn't have a religion without mythology. Perhaps religion is what happens when mythology is made is given an authority. Somebody says, this is what happened, and I mean this is what happened for us as a people, because mythology binds people together. It connects us as a culture, whether you're Christian, Jewish, a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or a Hindu, or an animist, someone who, which there are all sorts of flavors of, but loosely speaking, someone who, you know, sees perhaps spirits as occupying trees and rocks and natural objects, or maybe even unnatural objects. My personal specialty is in Japanese language and culture, so I always think of the kami that embodies or is incarnated in things in the world, natural and unnatural. But anyway, maybe that's when religion comes about, is when you actually have an authority, an authoritative figure, somebody who says, I will hold this together, I will tell you which of these accounts is right and which of these are wrong, which is an important thing. If you think about it, if I have a different account of what happens every time it thunders or rains from my neighbors, then for us to function as a community, it may be very important for somebody to decide who's right or who's wrong about that. And remember, this is pre-science. This is not philosophy yet either, which we'll say more about in a second. So mythology in this context then, what does it do? What do we mean by a myth? If history doesn't quite work the same way when it comes to mythology, what do we mean by a myth? Let's back up to that. So another category that we can give this is legend. What about legends? All right. And sometimes this too is perceived, a legend is something that isn't quite true. And perhaps that's the best way to view it. Perhaps a legend isn't something that is completely true in the sense that if we were scientifically able to study the person and the place and the event itself at that time, that we would find the account of that person that we have now to be completely accurate. Maybe that's part of what defines a legend, is that aspects of it are true in that sense, but other aspects are not. So what's an example of that? One of my favorite examples is maybe King David from the Old Testament in the Bible. Only Old Testament to the Christian Bible, of course. It's the Bible according to Judaism. King David, right, has all this territory and so forth given over by God as among the first of the kings to come into play after the judges. And as a historian, it would behoove us to look at that account of King David scrupulously and ask the right questions. And it would seem that King David is a good example of where you have someone who was probably real. There is an account of him. And yet, there is not a whole lot of evidence or reason to think that he had as much territory, or as much power at least, as he's claimed to have had in the text, in the book of Kings and so forth. So, does that mean it's completely false? No. It obviously doesn't mean it's completely true either. Not to say that it's only when something is completely true that it gets counted as true history. That's not what we're saying. We run the risk of biases and so forth in history. We always run the risk of leaving details out or getting details inaccurate. But the method's the same. And the content has that streak of looking to find an explanation of who actually was there, did what, and why. Versus legend. Legend could have elements that are mixed into it in order to help feed the account for what happened and why it happened. And it can often be for a very good purpose. It's possible that that story was written in anticipation of reconquering the lands of northern Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel was in decline and all that during that time. Okay, what about mythology then? I said I would back up to this. So is this just pure falsehood? Again, that's the way we typically think about myths. But what myths really could be thought better as is if legends provide explanations, history itself provides explanations, myth itself provides an explanation. It answers questions. What questions, you might ask? Well, Gardner actually gives us two very good examples. The questions that Sophie receives in her letters. Who are you, and where does the world come from? There are all sorts of other explanations that it gives too, along with that, but we'll say more on that in a second. It starts with these basic of basic questions. Who are you and where you come from, prior to any development of science, prior to any other developments by which we could try and come up, not even the thought yet of reaching back, looking for traces of that in samples of soil or the species around us, such as in evolutionary theory and so forth. Like, these are not the sort of explanations that are going to be provided necessarily offhand. Sophie gives a flavor of this. She says herself, look, the myths that I just heard in this, or just read in this letter by the mysterious philosopher, are explanations for things that I myself might have likely come up with, not having anything else to rely on. If I didn't know what the current scientific explanations were, I'd probably have come up with something similar to this. Interesting, right? So humanity across the globe has shared every civilization, or at least every trace of humanity I've ever seen in the world, anthropologically speaking, seems to have some mythological account of the world, prior to science, prior to what we would call today actual history, even when it's written down and recorded. And often that recording happens quite a bit later after the fact too, which is something else that there seems to be a trend of here. The farther back you go, the more mythological things tend to get, without the attitude of history involved, the attitude of I'm going to account for things that actually were here, actually happened, and so forth. You have explanations rather that are supposed to be traces within the world that people can read into for this or that reason. And then as we get into legends, you can see actually trying to incorporate actual elements while nonetheless still sort of trying to account for those things in a specific way that works for the purpose at hand. So there we have at least a little bit of a more rigorous idea of what myth looks like. It's not falsehood per se. It's an explanation for who you are and where the world comes from, in part, based on a pre-scientific way of thinking about the world. That applies, of course, also to more, we could say, mundane things. Let's take thunder and lightning. This is, of course, Thor and his hammer Mjolnir, and he's striking down the giants, or of Norse mythology. Right? You've got lightning occurring at the strike, and then you have the sound of thunder, the rolling of the thunder, either the might of the blast of the hammer, or perhaps even just the giants crying out in pain and agony, right? For thunder. Here we have naturalistic explanation. Oh, well, sorry, not naturalistic. We have explanations for nature. Naturalistic explanations are going to come later. We still haven't gotten to philosophy yet. We are getting, as it were, closer, though, to what we would call religion. Because these are the myths that we see today. These are the myths that at some point was decided on somebody to continue to convey through the culture and say this is what happened. And again, if we're going to think of religion in terms of like not just the myths themselves and the mythology, but the authority for deciding what myths to uphold and which to disregard based on different accounts, then we're still working our way through history, through time, getting to philosophy, as it were. We haven't reached science yet either. Obviously, the account of Thor is an explanation for thunder. It is an explanation for lightning. We wouldn't call it a scientific one, though. In fact, part of the trouble here is we'll see in the tension that builds, especially in the next lesson, that science versus religion is a long and dated antagonism. It's been head-to-head for some time. It's not always against each other. You have scientists who are religious. You have religious authorities who are very scientific in what they do. And some of them make very good philosophers as well. So it's not as bare bones as that. You're not either pro-science or pro-religion. But their reasons for justifying explanations are different. We can say that religious or mythological explanations are not characterized by, we could say, experimental, hypothetical reasoning. Let me take that back. Hypothetical, yes, but experimental reasoning about the world, questioning the things that came before it. So if in the earliest beginnings of a myth, someone looked and observed and came up, recognized as a people that this must have happened because this is, the story that makes the most sense for the world as we see it right now, pre-scientifically, then part of what you have is an explanation that shouldn't be necessarily questioned. So while curiosity comes up, it swells in us as early as childhood, as the philosopher says, we will have a story already laid out for us in the realm of mythology. And religion will be happy to provide that for us too. There will be an authority that will tell us what that explanation is. And deciding on what is or isn't true about that will depend on the authority. Nowadays, this is really actually very difficult to say for sure, because who's the authority in Protestant religion for, as an example, it's not just Protestantism, but Protestant Christianity. Who's the authority there? Is it your priest or minister, or is it yourself? That will come much later. We'll want to revisit this question when we get to those like Luther and so forth, Martin Luther, much later on. But the point here is that you already have an explanation. You already have the story. You shouldn't need to question it. Science has a very, very different approach to this. We're going to, again, see what the roots of science look like in the next lesson. But the whole point is to question at that point. The whole intention is to question at that point. Here is Xenophanes. He is one among many in this ancient Greek world where the Greek pantheon of Zeus and Hera and Apollo and all these other, Dionysus, all these gods who are the explanations for the phenomena that happen in the world. Well, Xenophanes, as much as anybody else, perhaps seems to believe in these gods, believes in their existence, believes they are who they are, and so forth, at least as far as this, at least as far as we can say they are there. But he, among other thinkers, are now starting to wonder, where did we get these ideas about them? They seem to do some very oddly, very hauntingly human things. They fight, they, throw stuff at each other, they betray each other, they love each other, they do all these things that are very human looking in origin. And he wonders if it's not extremely arbitrary, the sorts of things that are decided about them. Does the authority for a mythology or a religion actually just arbitrarily decide what is or isn't the case based on what works best in that moment for the community or for themselves? If that's the case, then it's not necessarily a truthful account. It's an account that just works. And so you have these people like Xenophanes who are wondering, maybe it's too anthropomorphic. So if by arbitrary, I mean that reason and so forth and something systematic, such as science will later become in another point in time, if something systematic is not being used to investigate, not just ask somebody else about, but actually investigate. Thunder and lightning. I'm told here in this society way back in the day that thunder and lightning is the cause of Zeus throwing his lightning bolt and We can see that. We can hear that. I have an explanation already. What if I wanted more? What if I wasn't satisfied with that explanation? Mythology is not going to help me out there. So if it's arbitrary in the sense that we don't necessarily seem to need to confirm it at every step, we don't see Zeus doing it in person, or at least not in a way that we would necessarily always come to the same conclusion about it, right? If I see thunder, let's say just a couple of hundred years later, I saw lightning and thunder and had no inkling of the works of Greek gods, the Greek mythology, I'd come up with another explanation. Also kind of arbitrary. Maybe Thor and his Mjolnir hammer, right? There's nothing that seems consistent about the way that these different myths form in the world, not among all people. And yes, it often has similar elements, which is kind of interesting, but it also doesn't provide a satisfactory explanation for a curiosity budding with interest of how do I really grasp what is going on in actuality in the world. And by anthropomorphism, we mean something very specific here too. This is another big word, but let's break it down. Now, I used the word anthropocentric in the last lesson. Let me write that up here for once. Anthropocentric, or for the first time, I mean. Anthropocentrism. Okay? Or to say something is, well, that's not how you write centrism. It would be centric and then ism. Sorry. Anthropocentric or anthropocentrism, right? For something to be anthropocentric, it must be centered around man. Anthropos means man or modern day human, right? Centric, center. So it's centered around man. It's centered around the human. When I said ethics is anthropocentric, this is what I mean. I mean it is about what humans should do in the world. But now, let's come back to this word anthropomorphism, which is very different in one regard. It's still about the human being. When something is anthropomorphized, or we say anthropomorphic, morphic means change. So rather than being just simply centered around the human being, we might change the things in the world to reflect what we think of as what is familiar to us as being human. What are some very easy everyday examples of this? Well, practically any children's movie that features animals, right? As among not just the main characters, but characters at all. I mean, I think of Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. That's what I grew up with. Mice don't wear pants and dance around. Not the ones I've ever seen. Unless you're talking about cartoons. Unless you think cartoons are real. Unless you think that stuff is real. So the point is that when we created those cartoons, it was fun to take a character that isn't human and make it do human things. What about the gods? Are the gods not treated the same way, says someone like Xenophanes? Are not, in a sense, these higher beings, these incredible beings responsible for our lives and everything? And again, he believes they exist. But have we not, in the ways that we talk about them and spread our myths about them, or convey our myths to later generations about them, are they not anthropomorphic? Do they not obviously have more to do with what human beings do than what maybe real gods do? This is the question, and this is a piercing question. He's not the only one, or necessarily even the first person to ask it, but he's among the best representatives of those who choose to go down this line of reasoning. We'll see next lesson other thinkers who are going to go down this line of reasoning as well, and they're going to come up with alternate explanations. We're going to notice something very important that I'm going to go on and bring up here, but then I'll go into detail next time, which is that philosophy comes last in this progression. We have the mythology, and let's say that religion perhaps morphed out of the, religion we could say morphed out of or captured the myths and mythology in order to then create a system of explanation with an authority on what those explanations are going to be. And then you have the science coming into the mix, and you could say the first scientists not having microscopes, not really using the scientific method, but doing something different, asking questions differently, as we'll see in the next lesson. And then we'll eventually see that philosophy further evolves after that. This explanation, or my chronology of this, my sense of philosophy coming last and as to when it comes is different from Gardner's. And I want to go on and say that right. But we'll see more about that next time. In the meantime, keep a heads up for these guys, not just Democritus and Heraclitus, but who we would call the natural philosophers. And what their answers would be to who are you and where does the world come from? We will be continuing to revisit these two questions over and over and over again. There's one very last quick thing I want to touch on, and that is the question, what is philosophy? Because we are starting with that question even as early as day one, and we'll be revisiting that question throughout the course. Let's go on and touch on it right now. What is philosophy? Maybe part of why this whole talk of mythology and the lead up to philosophy is important, because it helps us grasp what philosophy is in part. It's not as if philosophy ever stops itself trying to answer these questions. Who are you? And where does the world come from? After all, they frame the entirety of the book. They frame the entirety of the course that the mysterious philosopher is going to impart onto Sophie. So these questions, these annoying questions even, as Sophie characterizes them at first, and her mother and others will eventually characterize them as well, these annoying questions are the stuff of philosophy. And unlike mythology, there's not going to be any ready-made answers. In fact, unlike mythology or science, there's really always going to be a demand in philosophy for us to revisit those questions over and over and over again. So if we look at those questions in the context of mythology versus in science versus in philosophy, we're going to get different answers. But importantly, they often involve the same questions, and that's probably one of the most characteristic developments of this part of the book. See you in the next lesson.